Well, my name is Tad Seestedt. I moved to Oregon in 1993, and I had been living in New York City on and off for about 7 or 8 years. Prior to that, I grew up on a farm upstate New York and left the farm as soon as I could and thought I never wanted to go back to that, sitting on a tractor and an agricultural sort of lifestyle again, until I spent a number of years sitting in offices, and then I realized that I wanted to go back to sitting on a tractor again.
Well, so what kind of offices, what kind of work were you doing at the time?
I had government jobs and corporate jobs. I worked as a paralegal in a couple of law firms, but I thought about going. My plan was to go to law school, but after I worked at a law firm for a while, I changed my mind and decided that that probably wasn't what I wanted to do with my life.
So, what brought you out to the West Coast?
I lived in Seattle for a little bit less than a year in the late 80s, and I drove through the Willamette Valley, took a couple trips down here, and it reminded me a lot of where I grew up in upstate New York, pretty rural and, very agriculturally influenced with a milder climate. And part of the reason I wanted to leave upstate New York is, when, growing up there as a little kid, we'd be working outside all winter, and it would literally get so cold, in the winter, our skin would get chapped, and not just in the places that you expect, like on your lips, but your thighs, and it just seemed a little too harsh.
What type of farming did you do up there?
We had a small family farm, so we grew field corn, a little bit of oats, raised pigs, and we made maple syrup.
And what was there sort of as you're going through this, working different corporate jobs and things like that, when did kind of wine and spirits start to take your attention more than just as something you have on a Friday night or?
Pretty early on, actually. I think, probably after, living in the city for less than 3 or 4 years, I think probably by the time I was finishing college, I was already thinking it would be nice to be able to sort of live and work in the city and have that aspect of life, but also have a country life as well. And I grew up in the Finger Lakes, so there were a lot of grapes, not all wine grapes. There's, they grow a lot of Concord and grape juice grapes up there, but we're always surrounded by wineries, and I guess as much as I like eating pork, making wine sounded like a better way to integrate my dietary habits with career.
Yeah. Was there a kind of a I don't know, sort of a certain whiskey or wine kind of experience that you remember that stands out, where you kind of thought, "Wow, this is so special"?
I think I probably went the path that a lot of people do. I mean, I don't think I ever drank White Zinfandel, but I started drinking jug wines, and I didn't have a lot of money. That was like, the last year in college, and probably a couple of years after that, and I remember buying my first $10 bottle. I don't know what year that was. It was sometime in the mid '80s, and thought, whoa! And it was a cab from California or something, and then that sort of got things started like that. Wine really had this pretty broad spectrum of aromatics and flavor and mouthfeel and everything. And I had a job next to kind of on Central Park South, and it was within walking distance of a kind of a pretty big but well-known wine shop called Sherry Lehman. And after work, I would walk up to Sherry Lehman and talk to the wine guys there, and I really didn't know anything. And I would say, it's like, I just want to try different things, and I tell them what I was cooking that night and ask them what I thought I should have with it. And they were pretty Eurocentric, I suppose, But I just remember, tasting, like my first Alsatian white and being amazed, at how different it was from everything else that I'd been drinking, before that.
I've kind of heard that, Alsatian or that Riesling or Alsatian white wine has been an eye-opener for a lot of different people who make all different styles of wine that we've talked to. Why do you think that region and that style really seems to strike a chord with so many people?
I think they tend to be pretty powerful wines. Whereas, not that, if you're talking about Riesling, a lot of the Rieslings, and I'd say, Riesling is another varietal that got beat up on, because of what people just, made a general opinion of what Riesling was, and it'd be like the Blue Nun, some sort of pretty sweet, but tasty kind of picnic wine, but not serious food wine. And, I think that the Alsatian wines didn't really suffer from that same reputation. So the people on the selling end, in the wine shops, never really stopped being behind Alsatian wines. But I think they tend to be higher alcohol. There's a lot more going on aromatically. A lot of them are affected by botrytis. This is just my opinion. And in general, I think that's a good thing. They just had a lot of depth and I think more power to like grab you and say, hey, it's like, take a better look at what you're drinking right now and think about it.
And was there a certain kind of a moment or a period where you said, okay, I need to leave either New York, I need to get to somewhere where wine is made or, spirits are made, and, was there sort of a turning point or kind of a moment that you can trace back to?
Yeah. I made the decision that I wanted to get into the wine industry probably a good 3 or 4 years before I actually moved out to Oregon. But I needed to pay off debt first. I didn't want to just pack up and move somewhere and have, student loans to pay and other, kind of anchors. And I went back to night school and took chemistry and biology and thought I need like some sort of background and talk to the people at Davis, and my intention was to go to Davis and do the master's program there. And I'd also talk to the people at Cornell because that's kind of where I was from, but their program was different. It was more focused on pomology, not just grapes, but all fruits. And they didn't have, at that point, I think they have more of a fermentation program now, but they didn't then. I think I mailed letters out in, I don't know, it might have been September or October, and I said, hey, it's like, I want to, switch careers. I want to get into the wine business, and I like to, work in a winery, and I'll be out in Oregon in March. And so I went to everyone I sent a letter to, and I think a couple of them actually remembered reading my letter, but, and some of them told me, it's like, well, like we just throw those letters away. I'm like, oh, but I really meant it, it's like, here I am. And it took a while, to get a job. I started working, helping people bottle. I started working at Argyle part-time, and started working full-time at Argyle with Rollin. And I was also working part-time at Amity, helping Myron. And it just ended up that I ended up working with Myron for 3 or 4 years. And
what did people that you knew say after you kind of decided to switch careers and jump out here and basically no full-time job in the industry? Did you get any feedback about the?
They thought I was crazy. They all thought I was crazy, and it is. I didn't know anybody, but I knew a lot of the people that I worked with were not happy, and I think it's kind of that corporate sweatshop sort of atmosphere where like you're educated people, and you have degrees and you have a white collar job, and part of the problem is that a lot of those jobs pay pretty well, and a lot of my friends I think adjusted their lifestyle And as much as they talked about switching to something else that might be more, inspiring or artistic or something, they couldn't, and I guess I didn't really think about it that much. I just thought I'm gonna go, and it was rough, to have my income drop to 20% of what it was, for quite some time. But in the end, it worked out. It's good.
What about family, and kind of farming and that sort of thing? Did they have any thoughts on?
Our farm dissolved in the late 80s. It was like my last year in college, and I guess I had the opportunity to take it back, to move back and run it, but in my last year of college, I wasn't really of the mind to go back and do that. If it had happened a few years later, I probably would have done it.
So, could you have grown barley and grapes?
Not on our place, no. It was a struggle just to grow field corn. It's very rocky.
Yeah.
We weren't on the Finger Lakes. We were about 15 miles south of there, so it's fruit trees. Yeah, there's something could have been done, I suppose. And my mother called me out here, I wouldn't say weekly, but probably bi-weekly for the first 3 years, and asked me when I was going to go to law school, if I was still doing, the winery thing. So it took them a long time to really accept it. And I definitely, not everybody, but definitely some of my family members and peers, from professional lives.
So what were some of the things that you gave up then? Did you make any sacrifices to do this? Obviously, you gave up 80% of your salary and that sort of thing. But is there anything else that you had to give up or to make sacrifices to kind of get to this point?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is definitely financial, just because it's such a capital-intensive business. And when I moved out here, my idea was to buy a farm and plant vines and start my vineyard and then make wine from it. And part of the reason I wanted to move to Oregon is because I thought it would be less expensive. And where I grew up in upstate New York, people have lived there for 400 years, and it's still pretty sparsely populated. Land at that point, before the natural gas boom, was pretty cheap. And knowing people, I could have moved back upstate in the late 80s or even the early 90s and bought farm ground for between $500 and $1,000 an acre. And when I moved out here, it was, probably $3,000-$4,000 an acre or more for, choice land. And I was dumbfounded, so, I guess that in response to that, I thought I really can't buy ground and plant a vineyard and hope to turn that into a living. So I started from the other end and went backwards. Mm-hmm. So I started buying fruit and making wine, started the distillery, and was making grappa and brandy and eau de vie. And the idea was that would then pay to buy a farm and also a house. And this is kind of funny, or not funny, depending on how you look at it, but I had a savings, so my small life savings, and it was either enough to put a down payment on a house and buy a house, or start the business. And I chose to start the business. And right about that same time, the relationship that I had at that point ended because of that. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of sacrifices, but it's. I think if you're starting a business and you don't have investors and you don't have deep pockets and you don't have wealthy family members, it's just a longer process, and you just have to stay focused.
So you kind of sacrificed a relationship then.
It was for the best.
So it turned out well in the end.
Yeah.
So at this kind of same time, there's some other kind of winemakers that are peer group, and thinking of, and distillers too, so like Lee Medoff and Sam Tannehill and Jimmy Brooks are all kind of that same era of people making wine and spirits and that sort of thing. So what was it like being a part of, did you see yourselves as a group of people in the industry that were peers at the time, or?
Yeah, I mean, we all hung out together, we're all friends and, ate and spent time and drank together. So I think we had a lot of similarities, but different paths, I suppose.
So the spirit side of things, that was almost a way to differentiate yourself from, or to sort of a business model that you're following, or is there some sort of pull towards spirits the same way that there is in terms of wine for you just personally? Is it?
I guess for me personally, it was that it was this next level, of taking fermentation further on, and making wine, or thinking about making wine that was meant to go in the wine bottle, as opposed to making wine out of a fermentation that was meant to go in the still and become a brandy. And also, I knew that I couldn't, and this was another economic issue, that I couldn't really start my own winery because I needed to work in a winery to pay my bills. So part of the idea, with the distillery, was that it wouldn't interfere with, harvest and critical winery times, and it could wait until, the brunt of the winery work was finished.
What's different about kind of the spirits that come out of this region as opposed to other regions you've been, or other places? Is there a sort of a place-based component to the spirits?
I think so. I mean, I guess, if you're talking about brandy, I think most people would, immediately make a comparison to cognac, kind of being the benchmark brandy, for Europe and the world. Armagnac to a lesser degree, and then, some of the brandies from other countries, it seems like they really don't leave those countries. They make significant amounts in Spain and even Germany, but you don't really see them marketed in the United States anyway. So, and I think the difference here, or at least what I found, is that our fruit is different, right? So we're focusing on growing the fruit primarily to turn into wine, and they have a focus of turning the fruit into brandy, from the field through fermentation, through distillation, and it's just a personal, opinion. But I think that fruit, the better your wine tastes, the better your final product is going to taste that comes out of the still. And it just has more aromatics. And I think if you were focusing on growing fruit specifically for distillation, you probably tend to crop higher. That'd be the big, obvious difference. And that, comes into play because the reduction is enormous, so it's kind of almost a 10-to-1 reduction. So if you start with 100 gallons of wine, you end up with 10 gallons of brandy. And what I ran into in my early years of the distillery was just simple economics, that I could not sell a bottle of grape-based eau de vie for 10 times the amount that I could sell the bottle of wine for. There's just too much resistance. And, I think because of that, you see some American brandies and they're pretty expensive, but there's a reason for that.
Now, how soon after kind of getting into the distillery process, were you making wine the whole time as well, and having your own kind of label?
I actually started the label for the distillery first. My first vintage under my label for wine was 1999, and the first year for the distillery was 1997. So it took a couple of years to be able to make that transition, and part of it was because of the resistance I was running into on the sales end. So I was making eau de vie grape, from Riesling, from Gewürztraminer, from Pinot Noir, and a lot of people that I would show it to in the restaurant trade, were really into it. It was an easy sell, but there wasn't turnover, and I would go, I use Chicago for an example. I'd go back to Chicago in 1998 or 1999 or 2000, go to a restaurant, that had a bar and talk to the guys there. They go, oh yeah, hey Tad, it's like, good to see you. Yeah, what's going on? It's like, we still have your bottle of grappa on the shelf. It's like, you still have the same bottle of grappa? Yeah, it's great. We love it. It's like, oh, okay, well that's, that's, that's why, I'm only making a couple hundred cases a year.
Yeah.
So I think to become economically viable, I would be selling wine at the same time. Mm-hmm. I would go out on any given day, and I'd sell maybe a case or two of grappa, and I would sell 100 cases of wine. So it was sort of, the path of least resistance as far as growing my business. That wine just pretty quickly eclipsed production in the distillery.
So it's almost but that kind of having the spirits gives you sort of something that other people don't have. So it's almost like a reason to go and meet and talk with people about multiple things, and a way to help you sell the wine in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like.
Well, I didn't know. I mean, I think this is probably, I don't know what some of the other people have told you, but starting a business, I think for the people who come from a production background, we focus on production. We think, well, let's just make something that tastes really good and it'll sell. We don't really have our minds so much tuned into marketing aspects, and I think for me, I just didn't realize that most Americans didn't even know what grappa or eau de vie was. Like, why don't they drink a bottle a week? What's wrong? What's wrong with them? So I think that, that's a big part of it. For us here, we still make small quantities of brandy and grappa, but Americans don't drink a lot of that. And, we started making whiskey and gin 4 or 5 years ago, and it dramatically changed the distillery. We have 200 barrels of product that's aging instead of 4.
Now, you mentioned on your website, and part of your brand is using biodynamically farmed and sustainably farmed grapes, and it seems like a lot of folks kind of starting out at the time started to value that early on. I mean, people like Sam Tannehill says the same thing, and Jimmy Brooks was very much an advocate of that. Mm-hmm. So why is that important to you?
Well, most of what I buy is organic. Mm-hmm. I do get a little bit of biodynamic fruit that's Demeter certified, but not a lot. Maybe there's just less of it out there. Mm-hmm. But I think for me, it's more of being a good steward of the earth, and my farm's certified organic. I don't know if we'll certify with Demeter to become biodynamic. I think probably not. I guess the most important thing is, I think, just to do the right thing for what I think definitely our environment, on this farm, but it's definitely larger than that in scope. I think everything we do has an effect outside of our own sphere. So for me, that's the big reason. I just see, like personal experiences. We used to live on this farm outside of Dayton, and we rented that house there, an old farmhouse, and we lived there for a little over 10 years, and I think it was probably like the 4th year we lived there. It's not that the water became undrinkable, but it was deemed unsafe for pregnant mothers or children, under a certain age, and it's from nitrates. But, it's the result of fertilization, and not fertilization, from manure. It's, petroleum-based fertilizers. And that, I don't know, to me that was like kind of the final straw. I think, well, it's like, what's wrong? It's like we live in this place that's lush and green, and it looks healthy and vibrant, and we can't drink our water. Or maybe we can, being older people, but, kids shouldn't. Well, if it's not good for kids, it's probably not really that great for us either. And that was it. I just thought it's like the whole system and the whole mentality is just not really focused on longevity and long-term health.
So with folks like, were you part of that sort of working group with Jimmy and Sam in terms of they had a sort of study group for biodynamics and that sort of thing?
No, I think there's a lot of traditional farming aspects involved in biodynamics. I don't know that much about it, but I think as far as planting or doing things according to moon phases, people have been doing that for thousands of years, and there's reasons for it. Although a lot of those things have been forgotten, pretty quickly in a couple of generations, and hopefully it's not completely forgotten, and it can be brought back and put into use. And I like to say that just even in the winery that making good wine involves science and focus and love and maybe a little bit of superstition, but I think that some of it, to me, if I think about things scientifically, like from a chemistry point of view or biological point of view, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. So we used to have discussions about that. Yeah. I wasn't part of the group.
So what was your relationship like with Jimmy? He seemed to be kind of somebody that attracted kind of a big crowd of people and had big kind of parties with food and wine and that sort of thing. So what was that time period kind of like in terms of your relationship with him?
I think we were pretty close friends. I met Jimmy in 1996 when he was working for Willikenzie. I think that was the year he came back. And didn't start out that great. I think our first meeting, I wouldn't call it an altercation, but I went to Willikenzie to pick up some barrels for the winery that I was working for, and we had a big list, and I think we're getting 20 barrels or something. We had barrel numbers and everything was written down. And I'd spent the winery I worked for had a pretty dilapidated old flatbed that was actually dangerous to drive. I was nervous about it, and I'd spent the morning trying to bleed the brake lines and adjust the brakes because they didn't really work. And I pulled up to Willikenzie and had the load list, and I'd never met Jimmy before. He was there to help me load the barrels, and he said, "Well," I said, "Here's the list." And he goes, "Oh, well, we don't have those. We only have these." And it was like 6 barrels. I said, "Here's the list. I see the barrel numbers right there. So, what's going on?" And I think they had been promised to somebody else, but someone else who had more weight to throw around than the winery that I was working for. And so we had, a discussion about that. And I said, and I don't know what I said to him. It's been so long, and I said, I was, upset because I drove this truck that I didn't feel was safe, only to get there and find out that I could have gone up in a pickup, gotten the barrels, and got invited to a party at Jimmy's house, a month or two later, and we're been friends ever since then, So.
So did you kind of remember that first kind of meeting?
Yeah.
Afterwards,
Yeah, he said I was the uppity guy from the other winery.
So, what do you remember any of the kind of the stories from that time period of when you were friends afterwards? Of did you kind of realize that he was becoming a pretty influential person in the wine industry because you talked to people who knew him at that time, and then afterwards it seems like he's started a few things and inspired some people to get a number of people to get into the business and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I don't think I realized until afterwards. And probably because I was less involved in the viticultural end of things. But to me, Jim was just a friend that I would eat and drink with and go out and occasionally carouse around.
Did you know Janie at all in that time?
No. Not until after Jimmy died.
And then but after he passed away, you kind of gotten to know her pretty well, it seems like.
Yeah. He used to talk about her a lot. So, I heard lots of stories about her.
They were, it seems like two very different people in a lot, as close as they were in many ways. They were very different personality types. Did you kind of get a sense of that early on when you talked about her?
Yeah, Jimmy was, I think, a little intimidated or impressed with Janie. He'd tell stories about how she was not afraid of confrontation, and in a good way. When their parents were ill, if the doctors or the hospital weren't being easy to deal with, Janie would generally set them straight.
Yeah. And so he wasn't that way? He wasn't as confrontational, or?
No.
And
well, I don't know if confrontational is the right word,
yeah.
But he would say I would never, one of his stories that he told me was, there was a doctor who they were dealing with and their father was ill, and he had said that he was done working for the day and had gone home, but not all the questions had been answered. And so Jimmy was saying, I guess I would just go back the next day or 2 days later and try to talk to him. But Janie demanded his home phone number and called him at home. That's what I knew of Janie before I met her.
When did you meet Janie?
The day after Jimmy died. Or maybe that night, I can't remember.
And
might have been that night.
There's kind of a group of people that got together that are concerned about harvest and some of his commitments and fruit contracts and things like that. Were you kind of part of that group as well?
Yeah.
And what prompted you all to kind of get together and say, we want to help out here? I mean, it was probably the busiest time of the year for you.
It was getting pretty close. It was early September when he died, and that was a year that was not going to be a late one. It had been a pretty warm growing season, so we knew we were going to be picking in a couple of weeks. So, I think the impetus for that was two-part. One is I don't think Jimmy would have wanted to not honor his contracts, and his agreements with people. And, so the idea was initially it was like, let's get through this first year and take care of what needs to be taken care of. And another thing, that Jimmy said, more than once is that he really didn't have anything to leave to Pascal besides the winery. And that was his legacy for his son. And I think that, as far as being friends go, once someone's dead, there's really nothing you can do for them, but you can do things for their family or their loved ones. What
was kind of Jimmy's relationship like with Pascal? Did you see him around a lot, around kind of the winery?
Yeah, well, Jimmy and Bojana were divorced, so Pascal lived in Portland with Bojana, but would come down on weekends, and Jimmy went to Portland every Wednesday and picked up Paco and took him out and did things with him. So we still saw Pascal a lot, or we'd see him around the holidays, and we usually got together for Christmas Eve dinner, and we'd hopefully see Pascal for a little while, and he was still around. We got to play with him, and it was fun.
And do you still run into him now as with Janie, and when he comes up in the summertime?
Yeah.
Do you kind of see some people compare him to Jimmy and say he looks a lot like his dad?
He does.
Other people talk about his differences. He's got his own personality and that sort of thing. But what's it like to see him now after all of these years?
Well, he's a really good kid, and it's funny, after Jimmy died, and a lot of us, we were sitting around and talking. It's like, well, what can we do? It's like, how, we're not going to fill Jimmy's shoes as a father, but maybe we can be this group of adult guys who, Pascal can hang out with and talk to, and we can help give them insight to what Jimmy was like. Like Lee was joking around, saying like, well, maybe he doesn't want to be a winemaker. It's like, maybe he'll want to be a ballerina, that's just, that's kind of silly. But, I think part of our concern is that, we wouldn't want to be the adult group of men who try to push Pascal in a certain direction. So I think that was always an agreement, that we're all in agreement that whatever he decides to do is what he decides to do, and in the meantime, we can keep a winery going and help keep a winery going. And if he decides that he wants it, then it's there. And if he doesn't, then that's okay too.
Janie talks about you as kind of, for advice, and has all along the way. How have you seen her kind of change since she first got into the business?
Well, Janie's a force to be reckoned with. I think that if Janie and Jimmy had teamed up when he was still alive and running the winery, Brooks would be like, I don't know, an enormous, incredibly influential winery, more so than it is now. I guess I was a little bit of a detractor initially as far as growing the Brooks winery, and my idea was let's preserve a legacy. Doesn't have to be huge. It could even be like 300 cases a year, but let's keep it there and keep the labels and keep Jimmy's mentality and philosophy alive. And Janie now has grown the winery from 3,000 cases to 12,000 cases. Janie, she dove right in. It was pretty amazing. And, she has a lot of savvy, and she's a great person. This is an interesting anecdote, and I won't say who I made the bet with. It's another industry person. Well, during the Pinot Gold rush, that was going on in the mid 2000s, 2000 after Jimmy died, 2004, 2005, 6, 7, up until the crash of the economy, and we're all trying to grow our production and grow our businesses, and we were in that phase of life, and our businesses were in that phase as well, and I was talking to Janie, and I said, yeah, I'm trying to find some more Pinot, and probably looking for, 3 to 5 tons. And she said, oh, well, yeah, it's like I'm getting some fruit, and I think I'm going to have some extra, and I'll sell that to you. And this was I think it was the first of a few vintages where people started bidding each other out of contracts. So, I think historically in Oregon, growers always hoped that wineries would actually come through on what they said, and things kind of flip-flopped, and people were out there trying to get contracts away from each other, and something that had never really been seen, I think, at least since I'd been here. And from what I heard, that wasn't the case in the past either. And so this person, distributor person, was asking me like, well, are you going to have like extra production? Because, we want an extra couple hundred cases this year. And go, yeah, it's like, I talked to Janie, and she said she'd have some fruit. And he goes, like, well, it's like, do you have a contract? I said, no, we just talked about it, so I'm not worried. It's like, and he goes, she's not going to sell you that fruit. And so we made a bet, and the bet was like, okay, we have dinner at any restaurant, anywhere in the world. And that was the wager, so it was a pretty hefty wager. And I won the bet, and I think that's the kind of person that Janie is. She's incredibly hardworking, and she's just inherently good-hearted person.
What do you see? Well, Brooks is obviously growing bigger than it was. Do you still think there is kind of an element to what Jimmy brought in terms of, different varietals and a different approach to farming and winemaking that's still part of the winery?
I think it stayed pretty true. And I think that's something that is definitely important to Janie, but also, having Chris Williams as a winemaker. Chris Williams was Jimmy's helper and assistant. Chris used to work with Jimmy at Willackenzie, and then followed Jimmy to Mesera. So, I think Chris is probably the most in tune person, as far as what Jimmy would do in the vineyard or the cellar, and just basically what his philosophy was as far as wine style. It wasn't that someone had to come in and taste the wine, or look at farming records or something and say, hey, like, maybe this is what we should be doing. It was more of a direct relationship. And I think that farming-wise, winery-wise, everything is pretty true to what Jimmy would be doing.
I heard a number of people who are obviously folks who were close to Jimmy, but also people that just knew him, have said that, like with the Kennedy assassination or something like that, they all know where they were at the time when Jimmy passed away. Do you kind of know when you heard the news what was going on?
I do, yeah. I recently rented space in McMinnville to move. This is my first space of my own, because I've been renting space from other people for the winery, not for the distillery. And it was a Saturday, and I was driving in to do some work on my space. I was painting and working on plumbing and things like that. And I stopped by Jimmy's house to get coffee, and the ambulances were outside.
What happened next, or what did you do next?
I walked up to the door, and Jimmy was laying on the kitchen floor. He's dead.
And then you got together in between that time with some winemakers and things like that. How did that kind of come together? It seemed like you guys kind of rallied together and connected with...
Yeah, we called everybody, and a lot of people showed up pretty fast, So Dawn was there. Dawn Berry was his girlfriend. And he called her because his chest was hurting. And so I saw her car. She was upstairs, I'm not sure who was, there was, there were paramedics and people there. And I didn't know this at that point, but apparently they call some religious person, like a pastor or a priest or someone, to places where people have died. And so, spent time talking to Dawn, and then started calling people, So I called Lee, called Christian, and then that was kind of like the phone tree, and everyone started calling each other. And probably by, lunchtime, there was a pretty good group of people at Jimmy's house.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of people assembled in a short amount of time when they heard. And when Janie showed up, she suddenly started to realize kind of the scale of she started to see her brother in a different way because of the response that in those days. So, it seemed like, at some places hundreds of people were gathering at the funeral, hundreds of people. So, did you get a sense beforehand of the scale of the people that he was involved with, since you knew him so well, or?
Yeah, I think everyone knows each other. I guess in this, it's not that big of an industry, but I guess at least what was surprising to me is that he really did know everybody, and not just in a kind of superficial way.
Why do you think that was, that he connected so closely with so many different people?
I think besides just kind of his personality, is that he actually, I think he helped draw a lot of people together, and I think that's part of his gift. I think for us, it's like there's a lot of good friends that are friends because of Jimmy. He was kind of the magnet and the cement, at the same time. But I just, what was your question?
Let's see if I'm phrasing it properly, but just that if you got a sense of how important he was to this big extended community, if you kind of knew that beforehand, or if you found out more afterwards, how kind of influential that he seemed to be in the industry.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was really active, and I think that's one thing about Jimmy. It's like he was not just active professionally, in regards to his work. He was active socially. He was active in a social, professional way, with getting out and talking to people, and forming groups to discuss biodynamics and winemaking things, which of course, even when we're just socializing, would talk about that, obviously.
Did you have any times kind of sitting down, any particular meals, or do you remember any like kind of experiences with a bottle of wine or certain spirits that were like, kind of that really stand out for you, or either discussions that you had or something where you thought kind of this meal or this kind of bottle of wine or this conversation really?
I think it's all kind of a blur, I suppose, and
I've heard, I've asked this question to a few different folks, and they kind of come back, well, there are some that I can't repeat, or that I won't.
It's not appropriate.
I've heard that a number of different times too, but let's see.
I think is probably more than we talked about winemaking and grapes, and we talk more about philosophy and human interaction issues and historical things and political things.
What kind of role did and does kind of food and kind of meals just play, and wine just kind of play in your life now, even in your life then, and with that group of people, and now? What's the important?
I think it's just an integral part of all of our lives. I think that's why we have an attraction to each other and spend time with each other. No matter what we're doing that may seem our focus, really our focus is getting together to eat and drink. I think that's really what it all comes down to.
Kind of back to your to your business, Ransom has some connotations to
I chose that name Ransom partially because I had to borrow money. No bank would give me money. It was disturbing to me, that I felt like I had the professional credentials, I had product, but I couldn't make much product because I didn't have any money. So just tiny amounts, and I knew that I needed to grow, and the demand was there to grow, but I couldn't get a bank loan. I went to one bank that I went to. The loan officer was an old friend who used to be in the wine business, and he didn't laugh me out of the office, but he made it pretty clear that I was not the kind of person that was going to get a loan from the bank. I didn't have any collateral. I had nothing, and a pretty meager income, and a young business that was hemorrhaging money. It was very discouraging to work 80 hours a week for years in a row and just go backwards financially. And I joke around. It's like I say, like Mary is my partner, and if it wasn't for Mary, instead of maintaining a 200-pound frame, I probably would have been 130 pounds or something. Because literally did not have the money to buy groceries. So it was very difficult, and finally, I'd say after 6 or 7 years, it started to work, and that's part of the nature of this business, whether it's winery or distillery. It takes a lot to get started, and by the time you're selling your first product, it might take 2 years, but in the space of that 2 years, you've already had to create an inventory from another year, and possibly have 3 inventories before you're selling your first. So you just accumulate enormous amount of debt before you start actually selling any of your first product.
What would you say to somebody who's at, at the point where you were 10 or 12 years ago, kind of in that space, scraping by, or even sooner, they're just thinking about jumping into this. They have this idea, kind of like when you were in New York. Would you have any advice or?
I always tell people, don't quit your day job, which I did, and it would have been a lot easier if I had not.
Do you think you still would have stuck it out though if you hadn't kind of pulled the rug out from under yourself, or do you think you would have gone back to?
Well, at one point I quit my day job as a winemaker here, which was a big mistake, and that took me about a year to recover and have steady income again from working for other people. But I would encourage anybody. I just think that if there's something that people want to do, they should do it, and stick with it, and don't give up if it's what you really want to do. But there are other aspects. You do need to have some, maybe not a solid business plan, but a business plan that can eventually work. And that sometimes it's not easy to figure out what is viable and what's not viable.
Did kind of what you went through with kind of getting Janie started and keeping that business going, and kind of picking up, helping Brooks Wine get through the rough start, and seeing what happened to Jimmy, did that give you any encouragement or discouragement, or just going through that whole process of losing somebody who's part of your group?
I think the hard part about that, in respects to our business, was like things were just starting to turn for all of us. I think the early years are always a struggle, probably for everybody, but for Jimmy, 2003, I think we were all just starting to hit our stride, and that was, it's just, I guess it is what it is. It can't be changed, and the time that he had was definitely well spent, and he lived well, and that in itself is a good lesson to carry through life for all of us.
So yeah, a lot of things have changed then for you. You're kind of getting to a point where you're at the place where you want to be with your business. Lee is sort of expanding and doing really well, it seems like, and Sam has got a pretty substantial.
Sam's been busy.
So do you wonder that, of like what Jimmy would think of your respective kind of outcomes of your?
I think he'd be pretty happy. And I don't know, maybe it's a little corny, but I wonder if you can't see what's going on, or you wonder if why some things happen that are good, and hopefully they happen because you're doing the right thing, but also maybe there's help.
Do you have so any goals? Where do you want to be, let's say 10 years from now with Ransom? What would that look like?
Well, I think it's probably the same for all of us. In fact, a few of us were meeting last night, but we want to work less. We want to work less, probably be less stressed, and still continue doing what we enjoy doing. And I think that's just part of the process of building a business. The focus is to build it, and then once you've built it, to have it run in a way that works well in all aspects, not just financially, although that's certainly important, but in a personal way too.
So, well, great. I think let's see if I hit everything. Here's just kind of a question that sometimes end with. So just finish whatever comes to mind first, this short little sentence, but wine is ... what is it to you, or to your customers, or?
I guess for me, wine is it's an integral part of life. It's a food, and I think it's something that I drink every day. I'd like to think that other people would drink it every day. I've said this for a long time. I think if more people drank wine every day, the world would be a better place. Part of that is not just, let's get together and throw down some tasty wine and food, but I think a big part of it is that it slows people down. At least in our country, that's, one of the problems that I see, is that our lives are just so fast. We run and run constantly, and we don't take the time to slow down and maybe even, say hi to your neighbor, and that was, for me, like one thing about living in New York City for as long as I did it. I had people who I lived next to who I didn't know, and sometimes, if you said hello to people in New York City, you scare them, I just think that, that's a function of being in a huge urban, densely populated area. But even in the country, I don't think people really take the time to like sit down and, share food. And it doesn't have to be wine. It doesn't have to be alcoholic. It could be coffee or, juice or whatever. But for us, it's one of the things that kind of slows us down and makes us stop for a while.
Okay. Well, that's great.